Welcome everybody to our March 8th, 2021 virtual lunchtime lecture on the women of the Riordan Mansion. I'm Nikki. I am the park manager here at Riordan Mansion, and I'm excited to share some of the story about the women here. Of course, women in history have not always been represented. A couple quotes as little reminders. Women have made up half the human race, but you can never tell that by the books that historians write. And part of that is because the men's stuff gets written down. Their business papers are documented. They keep those business records, but those journals and personal letters don't always get kept. And that's where the story of the women are preserved. And I love Virginia Woolf's quote, just imagine if everything you've ever seen that says anonymous, even half of those were women, then women are much more represented in writing and in history and in art and everywhere else. And today is International Day of the Woman. So it's kind of nice that we're presenting this day. But I'm going to dive right into our Riordan family. But before we can talk about the Riordan family, we got to talk about where they came from. And that involves the Metz family and the Babbitt families. This is Elizabeth Spellmeyer Metz and her husband, Barney Metz. And they had a whole crew of kids. They had 6 girls and 2 boys, Mary, Anna, Edward, William, Caroline, Elizabeth, Blanche, and Alice. And they had a lovely house in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Barney was pretty well off. He was in the tobacco business, a cigar maker, and they were raising their family there when, unfortunately, Elizabeth's sister, Katerina Spellmeyer Babbitt, when her husband passed away. And so the Metz family welcomed Katerina and her 6 kids into their home. So these are those Babbitt boys. So Katerina or Catherine, it depends on where you see it written. She had 1 daughter and 5 sons, Lizzie, David, George, Billy, Charles, and Edward. So they moved into the Metz home, where the 2 families shared the first floor and the living spaces and took turns cooking for that whole crew of people. And the Babbitt family was up on the 3rd floor with the Metz family on the 2nd floor. So I doubt any of those kids got their own bedroom. I'm sure they were stacked on top of each other in that house with 8 Metz kids and 6 Babbitt kids raised all together. And as a side note, just down the street or around the corner, somewhere in that nearby neighborhood, was the Verkamp family, which of course will tie into our story. Now, of those Metz girls, the Metz family, 3 of the sisters ended up here in Flagstaff and lived in the Riordan Mansion. We have Caroline, Elizabeth, and Alice. And these young ladies, along with their sisters and their brothers and those Babbitt kids as well, were all very well educated at the Catholic schools in Cincinnati, the Sacred Heart schools and the Mount Notre Dame school. And I love the fact that Elizabeth, Lizzie, as she was called, she kept a copy of one of her report cards. It was actually taped inside the cover of a book. But look at these classes she's taking: English literature, algebra, modern history, chemistry, botanical analysis, French, 4th class, needlework, got to have some of that in there, domestic economy, linear drawing. So she's taken some pretty impressive classes. Of course, is doing a good job with her studies. In 1883, she was, I believe, 15 years old when this was her lineup of classes. So these young ladies are growing up in the Cincinnati area. Meanwhile, some families are heading west. The Babbitt brothers, they head west to get involved in cattle. And when they arrive here in Flagstaff, they meet the Riordan brothers. And Matt arrives here first in 1884 to work for the Ayer Lumber Company and invited his two younger brothers, Timothy and Michael, to join him in that business, and then bought it, creating the Arizona Lumber Company, and then later the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company. But being the leading businessmen in Flagstaff, the Riordans and the Babbitts became fast friends. They also became a little closer because both were Catholic families. So Caroline comes to Flagstaff to visit her cousins, the Babbitts, and their wives. Three of those Babbitt boys married for camp girls. And the timing of Caroline's visit might just be that first Babbitt baby born in Flagstaff. Not quite sure, but she comes to visit. And the newspaper reports on that visit saying that Miss Metz was heard singing in an impromptu choir to accompany the wheezy organ at Sunday Mass in January of 1887. And that Mass may not have been in this building. This is the first Catholic church in Flagstaff, because that wasn't quite finished yet, but they did, she was very active in the church, and kind of added to that. Their first meeting may have been with her singing in the choir. Well, I'm not sure exactly how Tim and Caroline met, but I assume that those Babbitt boys must have introduced Caroline to Tim. But before long, by April 1888, and Tim writes a letter to a friend of his in Albuquerque inquiring about a ring and getting pricing. And in May of 1887, he writes to his friend Victor Mendeleev, famed for his architect, famed for his work in excavating ruins around the Southwest with his brother. But he writes to Victor and he says, Miss Metz returned to her parents. If everything goes well with us, she will return in about 1 year, Mrs. TAR. Gosh, Vic, so you see, my dear boy, I now have something to look forward to, something tangible to work for and save up and go through life, not as if I were the only person on earth, as I know you imagined I felt. I'm going to make a determined effort to reform a great many of my ways, and I think I will succeed. So Tim Riordan was a little smitten with Caroline. The following year, Tim and Caroline marry, and we're very lucky to have their wedding portraits in our collection. And the Arizona Champion, our local newspaper, reported that T.A. Riordan of the Arizona Lumber Company left the first part of the week for Chicago. Rumor hath it that he will return with Mrs. T.A. Riordan. Of course, it doesn't get mentioned as being Caroline Metz at the time. She only gets introduced as being a future Mrs. T.A. This is their first home, and I love this. This is right after they got married. Caroline's up by the door and Tim here by the gate. And when you do zoom in, you do lose it gets very pixelated, but you can tell that he is just grinning ear to ear. He is so happy and so proud of his new house that he had built for him and his wife. Later in that same year, Michael writes to a friend and talking about Tim and Carrie. The family did call her Carrie instead of Caroline. And Michael at that time was living in Matt Riordan's house, which is right across the street, kind of catty corner from this house. But he writes to this friend and he says, Tim and his wife, Carrie, is the sweetest, most lovable little lady you ever met. Tim's house is within a stone throw of ours and is cozy, neat, and prim as a bird's nest. His mother-in-law was with them from May until the first of the month, and Tim was as proud as a peacock of her. Carrie is accomplished, a fine singer, and amiable as can be imagined. Tim is the happiest boy in Arizona. Celine, that's Matt's wife, and Carrie are as happy and close to each other as Tim and I. So good match. Elizabeth meets Michael. Now, the year after Caroline and Tim get married, they're expecting their first child, little Mary, and Elizabeth and their mother, Elizabeth Spellmeyer Metz, come to visit. And Michael writes about that meeting. And he said that that he was on his way to the train station to greet the two of them. When he stumbled across them, they had already left the train station, were heading toward Milton and to where the family houses were. And they were thrown together all summer long, collecting flowers for Mary's baptism, parties throughout the summer. By the end of the summer, though, they were walking home from evening services, and he wrote about this years later in his biographical paper on the family. And he said, I felt that marriage was out of the question because of my health and poor prospects. He had been struggling with tuberculosis. That's what brought him west, along with working for his brothers. And probably with this attitude on my part, nothing would have come of our relationship, were it left entirely up to myself. Elizabeth and I went to evening service together that same evening. When walking home, I spoke of going to Mexico on horseback with my friend Phil Holt, and immediately Elizabeth objected in such a way that I told her that the interest she showed was evidently more than that of a mere friend. We had not reached the old schoolhouse until we knew that I was not to leave Flagstaff and that we were never to leave each other. They decided that night to get married, and they became engaged and were married 2 years later. Before they get married, though, Alice comes to visit, and a wonderful picture of Caroline and Tim with that baby Mary and Alice. And the newspaper reported on it. T.A. Riordan, wife and baby, returned from a visit to relatives in Cincinnati. They were accompanied by Miss Alice Metz, sister of Mrs. Riordan, and she will spend the summer here. And it's unclear if she just came and spent that summer or if she stayed put after that, but she did eventually move here to Flagstaff. 1882 comes along. Elizabeth marries Michael. We don't have wedding portraits for those, but these photos are about the same time period. And of course, the paper is reporting out on the invitations are out for the marriage of Miss Mary Elizabeth Metz. And we haven't seen that before, but all the Metz girls were actually first name of Mary. So there was Mary Metz, then there was Mary Elizabeth Metz, Mary Caroline, Mary Alice, Mary Blanche, Mary Anna. Yes, they were all Marys. Fortunately for us, they did go by their middle names to make our lives easier to be able to tell who was who. So she marries Michael James Riordan in Cincinnati, and they're at the Price Hill Church. They built their first little house in Flagstaff at the right by the mill in the town of Milton. And I love the fact that their first house, of course, is right next door to Tim and Caroline's first house. Look how close they are. We're talking serious family time. They actually talked about, we came across a letter where Elizabeth and Caroline were discussing whether that was a good idea for the two families to actually just live together. But they decided they wanted their own space from each other, so they did build side by side instead. And both of these houses were added on over the years. But they definitely had their family time and family gatherings. This one, it does actually have a date on it of 1893. So we've got everybody gathered together. We have Caroline, their mother, Elizabeth Spellmeyer Metz, Matt Riordan, little Mary, Tim and Michael and Matt's dad, Timothy Riordan. We've got to keep moving my mouse so you can see the pointer. We've got Jean Sliker and Mrs. Sisson, Elizabeth and Michael, Mr. Sisson, and he was the treasurer in the company, Alice. We have Blanche Metz, their sister, Tim, Gertrude, and Frank Ketchum. So quite the crew of people. By 1902, 1903, the brothers and their wives decided it was time to build a much bigger house. And I think they enjoyed living next door to each other, but just wanted a little bit more space. So they built what we now call the Riordan Mansion. The family never called it a mansion. It was just their house. The East House and the West House and the two families did call each other the next doors. And when they moved in, Michael did write to his sister Nell about it. And he says, while we of course enjoy the change to the new houses, they do not at all increase our contentment or happiness. These things we found out long ago from our insides, and not the color of the wallpaper or the kind of wood in the window frames that may happen to be around us. The only things that the new houses do for us that the old did not is to give us more room to stretch in. And I actually, reading this quote really reminds me of the statement from Gustav Stickley about the arts and crafts movement. It was really about yourself and changing the world from the inside out. So this kind of ties into that as well. So Caroline and Tim did have two children, Mary Josephine in 1890 and Anna in 1901. Yes, there is a big gap in their age differences. We do not know for sure why. And then Elizabeth and all her children. She had Victor, which unfortunately they lost very young to pneumonia. He was only about 1.5 years. Blanche in 1896, Arthur in 1897, little Claire in 1901, just a couple days older than Anna, and then Robert in 1904, just a little one when they finished the house, and then Richard in 1907, a couple years after they built the house. Love some family shots, putting everybody together, the East House family, Caroline, Tim, Mary, and Anna. And then the West House family, we have Alice, Blanche, Elizabeth, Richard, Robert, Arthur, Claire, and Michael. And some of the other fun family group shots. We are fortunate to have a fair number of family photos. So showing these off is a lot of fun. You know, the family is they were all about family. So it was nice to be able to show off some of these for you. And I do have another letter that Michael wrote to his sister Nell. She was a shareholder in the company, which I think is all the women were shareholders in the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company. And Michael would write to Nell every month and give her an update, as well as send her monthly shareholders check. But this letter was written they just came back from a trip. He said, we are getting a great deal of enjoyment out of our little one. He has been the picture of health from the beginning. He's talking about little Robert. He has been the picture of health from the beginning and has been no care at all on Lizzie. I think he beats any of them so far as sleeping and eating are concerned. And if he keeps up his present lick, he will hold his own with Blanche for good health and spirits. Claire has not grown as rapidly as the others, but she has a very sweet disposition and is a great joy to her mother and myself. Blanche and Arthur are quickly emerging from the baby age. It is only this vacation that we have begun to realize that Arthur is a boy. He is out from the minute he gets up till he goes to bed, trading jackknives, roping burros, and making a general nuisance of himself. Both he and Blanche ride horseback nearly every day, and the effect shows in their good health. We've got First Communion with Anna and Claire. We've got Blanche and Arthur with Claire when she was a baby. We've got Mary with her cousins, Blanche and Arthur. This is one of the earlier ones with Elizabeth and Alice, with Blanche and Arthur, and one of the Babbitt kids. Anna and Elizabeth, and this one says the MJR sisters. That is Blanche and Claire. So a little bit more about Caroline, where she married Tim in 1889 and had her two daughters, Mary and Anna. Don't have a lot of information about her personally, as far as we don't have any of her letters. We just have her mentioned in other letters. We don't have any journals or anything like that. So all our information is coming from the family stories. She did not like to go out and do the local adventures out to Walnut Canyon and out to Painted Desert and down to Oak Creek Canyon. She preferred to stay home, and she would have the chocolate cake ready for when you got back, or one of her famous pies. She was well known for her baking, and we do have a copy of her cookbook that we've turned into an item to sell in the gift shop, but her pie recipes didn't make it in there. And I suspect that's because they were all those recipes were in her head and didn't make it down on paper. She was very active in the community and in the choir, the Catholic Church. She would visit the sick or the needy and bring them food and clean their house. And she would drag her granddaughters along with her on those. And she told them that it was more important to give of your own hands than of your checkbook. In descriptions of her, we hear of her kindness, that she was delicate, tiny, petite. She was only about 5 foot tall. This picture here, she's wearing heels, and Tim is over 6 foot, and you can see that lovely height difference. He stepped back behind her, and he's still a good head taller than her. And I love this dress here. We have it in our collection, and we do put it on display every now and then. So not sure what we'll have on display when we reopen, but this is one of my favorites in our collection. The granddaughters also talk about her reading stories to them. It was a regular thing. And when she read stories, she just didn't read the story. She put on a new voice for every single character. So she was super entertaining, and they loved to listen to her reading. She was very prim and proper and did make the girls wear dresses, even when dresses were no longer as much as stylish. We only have one picture of those granddaughters wearing jeans to go horseback riding. And another thing that she would do when the granddaughters were visiting, and if they had a big day planned and they had to get out up and out early, she would actually hide an alarm clock in their room so that they couldn't find it. And when it went off in the morning, it forced them to get up and tear apart the room to find that alarm clock to turn it off. It really annoyed the granddaughters, but it got them up and ready. Elizabeth, some wonderful photos of her. This one with little Claire. Elizabeth enjoyed travel much more than her sister Caroline, and she did go on frequent trips with her husband, with her family, and later years spent a lot of time going over to Europe to visit Claire, and I'll talk about how Claire ended up in Europe later. One of her most treasured possessions was a ring that Michael picked up for her in Pompeii. Unclear where he got that ring in Pompeii, but it was a gold ring with mother of pearl and had blue jewels. And I understand it's still in the family, as it should be. But she is also very active in the Catholic Church. She was a charter member of the Court of St. Teresa chapter, the Catholic Daughters of America, and the Altar Society of the Church of the Nativity. But more impressive than anything else is after Michael passed away, after her husband passed away in 1930, she took charge and ran Riordan's Incorporated, which was an investment company investing in real estate and the Northern Arizona Propane Company and cattle and a lot of different things. She was the president of the company from 1930 until she passed away in 1954. So quite a businesswoman. And as I mentioned, all the families were shareholders in the company, and they did have say over those shares. We do have some of Elizabeth's letters, but most of what we have is the letters she received from Michael when he was off traveling and doing things. And in those letters, they refer to each other as my dear girl and my dear boy. And often there's quite a bit of affection between the two of them in the letter. And I mentioned how they decided to get married on that walk home from evening services. But that day really stuck in Michael's mind because he wrote about it many times, including 26 years later. And he was in Baltimore and he wrote her a letter home, and he included with it a pressed flower as a momentum. And this is what he said. He said, I'm dog tired after my first day in Baltimore, but I can't let the anniversary of our walk 26 years ago tonight pass without recalling it. I think we were just about passing the old electric light plant by this time, and we knew that I was not going to Mexico, at least not alone. How short a time ago it seems, and how much joy and pleasure we have had in each other, and how little we could foresee the broadening life in front of us. And he signs the letter, good night, my dear, with them same love and fervor as the night so long ago, but still so near. Moving on to Alice. As I said, she came for the summer in 1891 and may have stayed, may have come back a couple years later. We're not quite sure. But when she did arrive here, she was definitely here to stay by 1895. And she volunteers to teach volunteers her time to teach at that first Catholic school to get it up and running, using that education that she got back in Cincinnati. She only did that for about a year before the nuns arrived and took over the school there. However, she continued to teach for the Riordan family, for the kids. They would go to the Catholic school for part of the day, but she would teach them at home the other part of the day. And here she is with Blanche and Arthur. And I love pointing out the kids' clothes back then. There were not boy and girl clothes until they got a little older. They were baby clothes. So yes, there's lots of boys in dresses in the photo collections. Alice was very active in the community. She was a socialite. You see mentions of her in the newspaper, of attending lots of different parties hosted by Babbitts and Verkamps, and of course the rest of the Riordan family. She was even mentioned as being a candidate for the Maid to the Queen of a carnival in 1899. Alice did not marry. We do know that she had a great romance, though, with author and secretary at the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company, Harrison Conrad. And we are trying to dig into a little bit more of what happened there. One of our volunteers is working on that research, and I suspect someday we'll have a presentation telling more about that story. She did enjoy the travel and would often go and visit her sisters, Blanche and Anna, who were nuns in the Convent of the Sacred Heart. She would go to wherever they were teaching. They taught in Cincinnati, they taught in Philadelphia, at Eden Hall. They also taught at Manhattanville, not both of them at the same time, but one of them did teach up at Manhattanville College in New York as well. And one of my favorite photos in our collection here is Alice with Mary, and they are visiting the Hopi Mesas. And they did their hair up in the style of a Hopi maiden. They were both unmarried young ladies, and they did their hair up in that style out of respect of their culture. Moving on to the children, we've got Mary first. This family knew how important education was and wanted their kids to get the finest, and that included the girls. Mary was well educated at Catholic boarding schools. All the girls went to Menlo Park in California, is where they started off at. and Mary's first letter home from school was saved, and she wrote on August 9th, 1900. So she's 10 years old. She writes, "My dear Papa, we will begin school today, and I think I will like it very well. Mama is still staying with me, but she will leave this morning. My hand is shaking a little this morning, and all my writing is crooked. How are all of you at home? With love from me, I am your loving daughter, Mary." She went on to continue her education by going to Eden Hall in Philadelphia. Obviously, her aunts were teaching there in those years, and then went on to Rome, Italy, and went to Stella Via for at least 2 years. Unsure if she actually got a degree or not. While she was going to school, though, at Stella Via, she enjoyed going to Paris for fashion trips and touring other parts of Europe. She was an outgoing woman. She enjoyed golf, although in our collection, the golf clubs we have were hand-me-downs from other family members, including her husband and her father. But she's a pretty famous lady here in Flagstaff. She has a lake named after her, Lake Mary. The board of the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company, the officers, decided to name it after her because she was the oldest. I hear from her, I had heard from her daughters that she didn't like that the lake was named after her, but accepted it. Very active in the community as well. While living here, also mentions of her attending parties and things in Flagstaff. She met her husband, Bob Chambers. He wrote about their first meeting, and he wrote up a little family biography, and he said he met his wife when he was 4 years old, and it was love at first sight. A very sweet thing to say. His father was the vice president of the Santa Fe Railroad, so a lot of business relationship between him and the Riordans with the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company, supplying it timber for the railroad ties. So they knew each other, grew up together, and they were a perfect match. Mary and Bob did have 4 children. We have Helen, Mary, Robbie, and Rita. Unfortunately, they lost Robbie very young, 3 years old, to leukemia. And the family says Mary was never the same after that. Her heart was broken, understandably so. She was very active in the church, a member of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre, which has the mission of preserving the Holy Lands. And her and Bob donated over the years to the construction of many, many Catholic churches around the world. She was a shareholder of the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company, and I actually have records of letters between Tim and her husband Bob talking about business things and this and that, and Tim will write a bottom line across, what does Mary want to do with, what about those shares? What's the decision on this coming up? And Bob would politely write back, as far as Mary's shares go, you'll have to talk to Mary. So he stayed out of her business decisions, which I think is really amazing. Mary was also involved in the Northern Arizona Pioneers Historical Society, which of course helped start the Pioneer Museum. Moving on to Blanche, Mary's cousin, and she was born in 1896. And by the time the Riordan Mansion, the house was built, she was 8 years old. And Michael once remarked on her that she would rather be on the back of a horse than on her own 2 feet. And here she is on Snugs, her horse. Lots of great stories of her just going off and exploring. She also went to Menlo Park in California, and then went on to Holy Trinity in Washington, D.C., and earned a bachelor's degree. While there, she did spend quite a bit of time in DC and was privileged to be in the U.S. House of Representatives On the night of April 6, 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson led the United States into World War I by declaring war against Germany. Now, Blanche wanted that education, but she didn't want the liberal arts degree that she probably got. She wanted to be a nurse. And we have stories that she smuggled books into the house. But when Michael found them, he threw them away and told her that she didn't need to have a job. That wasn't what he had in mind for her. But she never gave up that passion. And later in her life, she volunteered at the Flagstaff Medical Center. She even managed to get a little bit of work in during, I'm guessing, World War II. The comment that the interview that this is from didn't say for sure, but it said, "I worked for 4 years during the war as a Red Cross nurse's aide, and I really got my baptism there. We did all the dirty work there was to do, and I was up there for 4 years, and I loved it." Here's her wedding portrait, and she married Walter Chambers in 1923. Yes, you've heard that name before. She married Bob Chambers' little brother, Walter. Now, as I mentioned, Mary and Bob were a great match. They were very complementary, perfect match. Blanche and Walter, not so much. Blanche was an outgoing woman. She was a woman of the 20s. She wanted to do things. And Walter was not that kind of person. He did not want to see her off doing things. He wanted her home and doing what he expected of a wife. They had 2 children, Walter and Brian, and they separated after about 5 years. And she came back here to Flagstaff. He was living in Los Angeles, moved back here to Flagstaff, and she lived in Elizabeth and Michael's first house up the street until it burned down. And then she moved back into the west house of the Riordan Mansion. Had a conversation once with one of her granddaughters, and she said about the relationship between Blanche and Walter. She said that Blanche had told her, "I would rather be beat to death than bored to death." So that tells you a lot about their relationship. While they were getting the divorce, she did wait till after her father passed away to file for divorce. There's letters back and forth between Tim and Bob Chambers, and one of those mentioned, "I'm not surprised considering what happened at the wedding." And I've asked family members if they ever heard what happened at their wedding, and no one knows. So maybe someday I'll stumble across what happened at Blanche and Walter's wedding. And we do have a group photo from their wedding. Here's all the family, and Blanche is like looking down at her toes. So I'm guessing whatever happened had already happened there. So we've got our 2 Riordan Chambers weddings here. This is Mary's wedding. Here she is, and the shepherd's crooks for her bridesmaids. And then, of course, Blanche's wedding. And from this photo, we did crop out the picture of the 3 sisters, Elizabeth, Alice, and Caroline Metz. And a bonus wedding photo for you. This is in the 1940s. This is Emma Jean Babbitt, and this is Caroline wearing her 1880s wedding dress with Tim, and then Elizabeth. And it's unclear if this is her wedding dress or just another wedding dress that was around that she was able to fit into. Moving on to Claire. Born in 1901 in Los Angeles. Apparently Elizabeth decided to have the birth over in Los Angeles, perhaps for medical reasons. We don't know for sure. She was born on Good Friday, and her cousin Anna just 2 days later. The 2 of them inseparable. We saw their first communion photo earlier. Another well-educated lady went to Menlo Park, then later went to Lake Forest along with Anna, and then back to Menlo Park. She did say in one of our interviews with her that she did not get a degree because she decided to go for the MRS degree. the Mrs. She married Bill Quirk, and she did travel. She went to Europe on one of the trip in 1925 is a pretty fun trip to tell about. It was Anna and Claire. Tim was their chaperone, and they had a couple of their friends from school. So he chaperoned these young ladies all around Europe, including having Easter Sunday Mass at the Vatican. And it's possibly on that trip that she met her husband, Bill Quirk. It depends on which story you believe as to how they met. The exciting one is that they were staying in a castle. Tim and these young ladies, they were staying in this castle in Ireland, and this guy was running through the forest and swam through a moat and came up to the castle to take shelter. And that is how he met, she met him. And they later followed her to Arizona and got a job at the lumber mill. Or he simply got a job at the lumber mill and they met there. He was very active in the Irish Revolution, and the rumor is that he did have to leave the country for a while to let things die down, but apparently not too long, because in 1928, Claire and Bill were married in Los Angeles, and here they are, ready to board their steamship to head to Ireland, where they lived in his castle, Ballinard Castle in County Tipperary. And since she was so far away, her wedding presents did get mentioned in letters. Michael sent her a heating system for the castle. And Tim and Caroline sent them money so they could buy a piano, since they didn't want to worry about having to ship one from so far away. All the stories, whenever you see any of the stories about Claire, they always say she was a clothes horse and was very into fashion. And so they talk about her teaching her nieces and nephews and family members, how the importance of dressing and looking beautiful. A few of her pictures, one with her mother, and this one here is labeled as Claire on the Hippogriff bench. And our best guess is maybe this rock here, they call the Hippogriff, maybe, I don't know. But you can see the lovely view of Mount Eldon back there. And here she is, this little one. And on to Anna, born on Easter Sunday in 1901, and right here in Flagstaff. Also well educated at those same schools, Menlo Park, going to school, sharing a room with each other. And we have her first letter home from school at Menlo Park. She writes, "My dearest father, at last I am at school, and I cannot say that I like it very well, but everyone is so nice to me that I expect I will like it better in a little while. I am in the 6th class because I believe the 5th would be a little too difficult. I have a great deal of fun at recreation. We played baseball after dinner, and I think our side is ahead. Blanche, Claire, and myself have a room together, and it makes it very nice. Before I left the hotel, Mother and I went to see the Trail of the Lonesome Pine. It was fine. I am first getting used to the rules and the different things I have to do. Miss Charles, I think this is how she spells her name, gave me a lesson in music yesterday. I like her quite well. Will you please let Mary read this so I won't have to write the same thing over again? Love to you and Mary from your loving daughter, Anna." So she's going to the same school at Menlo Park with her cousins. Does eventually go on to Lake Forest with Claire as well. And then finally, she earns a bachelor's of arts in rhetoric at the College of the Sacred Heart, Manhattanville, New York. Another adventurous young woman of the 20s, getting out there, exploring. Here she is at Slide Rock. You can see the edge of the original bridge over Oak Creek Canyon there in her background. Very outgoing, would travel with her father, went to Europe on a few of those trips with him. And that trip in 1925, she bought lace for her wedding veil. She was engaged to Jerry Doolin, and this is cropped out of that letter where she drew a picture of the lace and describes that with this lace being so beautiful and fancy, She didn't need a very fancy dress to go with it. She did not get to wear that lace. A couple years later, she died from complications of polio. It took her very quickly, just a very tragic time for the family. And in other letters talking about, when she passed, they talk about her being engaged to Mike Purcell. So I'm really curious. One day we'll find out what happened to poor Jerry Doolin and how did she end up just a couple years later engaged to Mike Purcell instead. Her graduation photo here at Manhattanville. And I love this. This is one of our few photos with animals in the picture. We've got her holding a puppy. And there was more women in the Riordan Mansion than just the family members. There were the servants, and there was a variety of servants that worked for the families over the years. They did a lot of the different chores that needed to be done, from churning the butter, making the bread, sewing the clothes, fixing items, doing the laundry, and cooking the food, of course. And we do have some stories of times when they couldn't find servants' help. They would actually advertise back east in Chicago or Cincinnati looking for help. But most often the servants were locals, and they were somebody that, their father worked at the lumber mill, and the teenage girls would come over and work for the family for whatever needed to be done, particularly for, housework. We do have a few servants, though, whose names made it into the record, and a few that got their pictures taken. This is Mary Durr, and she apparently traveled with the family to help take care of the kids on this trip to Long Beach. Is this her again? Not sure. It's hard to tell with the way that picture turned out, but this is Robert and Richard. But we do have mention of Mary Durr and Molly working for the Westhouse family in 1909. Mia Nygaard working for the East House family in 1910. And Florence, who worked for the East House family as a maid and kind of stuck around when she married Salvador Perez, who was the groundskeeper, and they lived in the gatekeeper's cabin on the property for a little while. The Encinoso sisters from Spain that worked for the family, and recently got a little bit more information about Essie, who worked for the family, and fun little story about when she was working for the family. When they had big parties, they would have help porters from the railroad stay overnight and help out. And these were typically Black men. And Essie was a Black woman, and she, when she was working for the family helping out these parties, she said after the party was over, Mrs. Riordan, unclear which Mrs. Riordan, would make sure that they counted the silver, that all the silver was accounted for, because they didn't want to make sure, they wanted to make sure they didn't lose any of it. And Essie laughed that Mrs. Riordan was so concerned about her silver. Meanwhile, the cook was giving them all the leftover meat to take home to their families. And they're like, yes, meat, fresh meat, yum. Working for the Riordans was definitely better than working for other places, because they did have the modern conveniences in the house. They had the electric lights, the hot and cold running water. You can see the water heater here next to the coal-fired stove. So they had some of those modern conveniences they could utilize. Down in the basement, they did have a laundry room. In the early years, of course, it would have been the scrub board, but they did purchase washing machines over the years to help out with that those extra chores. So that tells you a little bit about all the women in the Riordan Mansion. Just a quick reminder for upcoming events. You can always visit our website to see what's coming up. And since we don't have you all here in person with our RAN can to shake and show off, you can make donations to Riordan Action Network online, and those donations do help us here at Riordan Mansion with preservation and projects and programs. And when you do go to that page, will see it's for Northern Arizona Pioneers Historical Society, which of course is Riordan Action Network is a part of, and you can choose Riordan Mansion as your designation.